Let's go Studies in John, number 109. As we continue this journey, we finally make the turn into the 18th chapter tonight of the great book of John. I have had a good time wrestling with, and I say wrestling, I mean that in a very good way. Not in any way do I ever use the phrase wrestling as if I don't want to do something and God's trying to convince me. I use the phrase wrestling with turning things over, working them out, asking questions, seeking answers. So I've been wrestling with this one tonight for a while. I knew this was coming, and this is one of those unique moments in John that doesn't appear in the other Gospels, at least not in this exact way. We're going to talk about crossing Kidron tonight is our subtitle, and this is a moment where Jesus is on his way into what will be this fast, almost downhill pace for the next several chapters into Passion Week. Jesus has arrived in Jerusalem, and we have spent months now with his speeches, his sermons that encompass most of the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th chapters, and all kinds of theology came out of those 4 chapters. All kinds of things about our place in him, the Father's unity with us. We did a lot on the vineyard, on the roots and the wine, and how you and I are part of this process of cultivation and this process of fruit production. We talked about all kinds of stuff. I think it's probably 4 chapters that are the most valuable chapters for New Covenant theology outside of anything else in the New Testament, and I've enjoyed that journey. So for the last several months, we've rolled the words and read over and over and over again. But now we make the turn to the cross. Things speed up in a hurry. A lot of characters run on and off the stage from here, and some of them are they're all worth a little bit of attention, or otherwise they wouldn't be mentioned. Some of them are worth more attention than others, perhaps. But I've always been really intrigued with Gethsemane. I've been so fascinated by this moment that would take Jesus to the very depths of the human experience, that Jesus would suffer in a way that is very relatable to us, pressed by his future. Who hasn't been pressed by their future? Who hasn't been concerned of what they're about to go through the next day? Who hasn't, and maybe this was metaphoric, maybe it was literal, but for us it's probably metaphoric. Who hasn't sweat as if it were great drops of blood? I think what that means is who hasn't put a piece of their life into their toil, into their sweat, into their stress? Who hasn't died a little bit inside as they face the difficulties of life? That's the beauty of Gethsemane, is that we get to watch Jesus walk through the same valley we're going to walk through. And we know because he went through it and came out the other side, we have hope. This is a great passage of what it looks like when a human being is pressed. And it's also a great passage on what happens when you've already experienced the wilderness. Remember, early in his ministry, in fact, the first public act of his ministry, Jesus comes out of the waters of the Jordan baptism, and he is led by the Holy Spirit into the wilderness, where he doesn't eat or drink for 40 days or 40 nights. And having not ate for 40 days and 40 nights, at the weakest point of his physical existence, he is met by the devil. And he has this confrontation of essentially Jesus overcoming the snake. He goes down into the basement, so to speak, and to the darkest place you can go. And he encounters the dragon, and the dragon always questions your identity, and he fights against who you are. And Jesus overcomes him the same way Revelation overcomes. The saints overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. And here comes our Lamb coming out of the wilderness armed. And I always like to think that the way to survive Gethsemane is to go through the wilderness. Because once you've faced off with the enemy and you've overcome by identity, I know who I am. Yes, I am the Son. And you don't surrender that, and you don't lay it down easily. You hold on to it. You can take Gethsemane, whatever life presses you, however bad that it gets. And for those who encounter the issues of life and the issue swallows them, they're usually those who have been ill prepared by having had an experience, by having faced any kind of turmoil in their life. This is why I don't want believers to run from turmoil. And I don't want them to run from chaos. I want them, in effect, not to look for it, but to run into it. If the storm encounters you, sail your boat right through it. If Jesus is in your vessel, you can't help but make it to the other side. And you will be more valuable to yourself and to everyone in that boat and to every other boat you'll ever be a part of. You'll be more valuable for having went through a storm. Remember what we said a week ago where Jesus, or a couple weeks ago, I'm not sure, where Jesus says to Peter, I'm praying for you, Peter, so that when you stumble, you won't lose your faith. In other words, you're going to have struggles and problems, but you're going to come through it. So I don't advocate looking for problems, but man, don't ever run from them. Know that you're equipped. And if he who's on the Lord's side, I mean, who can be against you if God is for us? And so all of those things coalesce in one way or the other right here as Jesus walks into Gethsemane. Let's introduce two geographic places. Every gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they all tell the story of Gethsemane. And that is rare. Not all of the Gospels share the same stories. They tell different stories. When they tell the same story, pay attention. The authors felt it was so big you didn't want to miss it. They all tell you about Gethsemane. Gethsemane, by the way, is the place of the olive press. It is literally an olive grove. Some of the trees in Gethsemane have been carbon dated all the way back to the 5th and 6th century that are still standing there growing to this day. And it's believed by those who know what they're talking about that those trees that are from the 5th or 6th century may have actually descended from trees that Jesus would have sat under that night in Gethsemane. Point being, for at least a couple thousand years, this has been a continual place of the pressing of the olive oil. But only John's gospel, of those four, only John's gospel gives an actual geographic link, which is Kidron, a valley/river. You're going to see it referred to as both through the Old and the New Testament. The Kidron Valley, which lies outside of Jerusalem, and inside of that Kidron Valley is this Garden of Gethsemane. Now, you really can't put a lot of stock into what religious, that's the wrong word, what Christian sects or Jewish sects claim as the garden. Jesus prayed here. You can't put a lot of stock into that, because if you go to Gethsemane, there's 5 or 6 spots that everyone claims was where Jesus had his prayer. Because man tends to sort of idolize the natural. You know, this is where Jesus sat down. This is where, and we get, that's probably a good thing we lost the Ark of the Covenant a long, long time ago. Because if there's anything that would fascinate and infatuate the modern mind, it would be, this is it. And we would even, I think the Lord got rid of stuff like that so that we would put our focus where it belongs instead of where it doesn't. So I'm not going to make a geographic case tonight, because we can run into that problem. You're going to see a lot of Old Testament text this evening about Kidron with a very important spiritual lesson. When you go to Kidron, you don't get anything. It's like going to get baptized in the Jordan, which people do all of the time. Fine and dandy. You want to get baptized in the Jordan, do so. But don't assume that by being baptized in the Jordan, you have a closer link to the Spirit of the Lord, or that you somehow have something Jesus had that you didn't have before. That is elevating the natural to the level of the supernatural, to the level of the invisible. And that's, well, it's anti-Christian. It's anti-Christ. And so no condemnation to those who have those trinkets or ideas, but that's not what I'm aiming for. What I am aiming for is the fact that it's not just a historical truth, but also a spiritual truth in listing Kidron among the story. It's written last. We know that for sure. We're not positive when John's gospel is written. I've said this 15 times in this study, but I want to repeat it because it's important in lessons like this. It's definitely written last, which would lead me to believe that John's gospel is filling in the gaps. It's covering the little spots that didn't get covered in the Matthew, Mark, and Luke narratives. It's saying a couple of things here and there. It's more than a couple. It's a lot. It's most of the book of going, hey, here's a story you didn't know about. Hey, here's a little detail they didn't tell you about that might be important. And when that happens, I don't think it's coincidental. And I don't believe that John's just tossing them out there to just kind of round out the story. I think he has an intent purpose. There's a reason he wants you to see these things. And I think it's to shine a light on Jesus in a very unique manner. So I want to read the first 5 verses of John chapter 18 as we begin. And I want you to take a look at this brook. I want you to take a look at this garden. And I want you to take a look at the cast of characters that walk on the stage first in this story. Because the people that walk on the stage first are the whole reason Kidron is mentioned in the first place. John chapter 18, verse 1, when Jesus had spoken these words are our last several months of study. That's those words written in red 14, 15, 16, 17. It's been a long journey to this moment. When he had spoken this, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. The other Gospels tell us this is Gethsemane. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So this is something he's done over and over. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. 4. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them. Now, that line is its own lesson, and probably have to deal with it next week. But I just want to say right here, only Jesus can know what's going to come upon him and go forward. But that's the lesson he's wanting us to learn. It's the thing he wants us to take away from this, is to have the foreknowledge that what you're walking into won't be easy, but that you don't turn around and walk away from it. To walk forward even though what is coming upon you is difficult. And technically, knowing all things that would come upon him, in the Greek, the phrase is closer to the word descend. Jesus knowing all the things that would descend upon him, that literally just fall on him. This avalanche of issue, basically personified in the man Judas. I got to walk right in and face my betrayer. He says to them, "Whom are you seeking?" And they answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with him. So we're going to do some work in the coming weeks on the garden encounter. And probably by next week, the garden encounter, and we're going to read some of tonight what we'll end up jumping into next week. But I want to focus on Kidron, because this is a story in which John drops a geographic place that's foreign to us. We haven't ever seen it in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. We haven't seen it in John till now. Boom, here's a new place. But to a Jew, to someone alive in the time of Christ who knew the Old Testament and the stories of the Old Testament, Kidron has a very important place in their lineage and in their heritage. And so understanding a little bit of what they understood might help us. And so here's a thought to get us started. In Israel's history, when they transitioned into a new state of righteousness, I didn't like that statement when I wrote it. I don't like it any better now, but I don't have a better statement. So I tried to qualify it with this, and then I thought I could just talk about it. In Israel's history, when they transitioned into a new state of righteousness, where they entered a new era of authority, it's not really a new state of righteousness. Like they were right, but then they entered into being more right. That's not possible. But through an old covenant paradigm, righteousness is right standing with God based upon keeping your end of the covenant. And primarily, national Israel's end of the covenant was take care of the widows, take care of the fatherless, take care of the stranger. You do that, you get to live in the land. You don't do that, you get booted. There could be a foreign invader that's going to beat you up. And that happens over and over in the Old Testament. They take care of the widow and the stranger and the fatherless, they get to live in the land. They don't, boom, they go. So every time they have a revival, and literally have a revival. And I don't mean like 5 nights at 7 o'clock with music and offering and a sermon, but I mean a revival of their spirit where they go, we're not doing what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to be taking care of stuff. Every time that happened, they moved into some sort of new level of authority. Then there's a repeated pattern that happens every time in which they destroy the idols that represent their past. And so every revival of spiritual authority or righteousness that happens in Israel, they go clean out their closets. They clean out their yards. They clean out their temples. They clean out the groves and the high places. They knock down their idols. They throw in their little statues. They have massive burnings. They have, like when we were kids and you went to youth camp and you had record burnings, which was a shame, but there was records being burned and destroyed because, or book burnings, which seems so un-American, even though, they were filthy, the stuff that needed to go. But it was a little bit like that in Israel, and they were doing this in a literal fashion. They were taking all of this idolatry, all of these things. And the reason for that is because God would have no rival for their affections. So if you're going to come back to me, then you're going to get rid of everything else. And to me, what that says is, it's a prelude to what is the hallmark of the marriage covenant. Because the hallmark of the marriage covenant is exclusive intimacy. That's there's no room for a third party. There's no room for outside members into the covenant. That's the biblical example of marriage that starts in the garden, where God says, man, cling to his wife, let them be one flesh. Jesus comes along, gives it that sanction, goes, what God put together, don't let any man separate. And whenever we see Israel adding to that through natural marriage, when polygamy enters the scene in the Old Testament, chaos. We're going to find some of that chaos in one of our stories tonight. But the God way was that exclusivity of covenant be between the man and the woman, and there be no outside influences, so that the intimacy doesn't happen between parties outside of covenant. It doesn't mean you don't have friends outside of your marriage. It means that you don't share your heart of intimacy outside of your marriage. And why? Because that was the way God wanted to treat man. That I have an intimacy with you, and I don't cheat on you by being intimate elsewhere, and you don't cheat on me by being intimate elsewhere. And that was why they burned the idols. So when they would enter into a revival state, so to speak, they would purge themselves of all of the old, because all of the old represented a cheating state. The first great example of this is when Israel comes out of the land of Egypt. They've offered up the Passover lamb. God sends the angel through the houses of Egypt, and the whole "when I see the blood, I'll pass over you" story occurs. And Israel comes out in mass. Some scholars say 3 million, 600,000 to 3 million people come rushing out of the land of Egypt. They spoil the Egyptians of their silver and their gold, and they walk out into the wilderness. And this incredible journey begins basically between God and Israel. And it's a marriage. And it's supposed to be exclusive. And yet, at the very first opportunity to go off on their own and explore their liberty, Israel creates the golden calf. And so the Old Testament narrative is built around that incident of the very first moment you have any kind of liberty, go off and build the golden calf. You go off and build some form of idol in which you've replaced me. And so Moses comes down the mountain with the 2 tablets of stone. He sees the golden calf, and you know the story. He breaks the tablets, and then he throws the golden calf into the fire and burns it up. And when Moses retells the story, he says this in Deuteronomy 9. Now, of course, that story happens in Exodus, but I want to show you the retelling. In Deuteronomy 9:21, Moses says, I took your sin, the calf which you had made. So, by the way, your form of idolatry in this story is the sin. The calf which you had made, I burnt it with fire. I crushed it. I ground it very small until it was as fine as dust. And I threw its dust into the brook that descended from the mountain. Now, Deuteronomy does not tell you what that brook is called. We don't know. And I'm not going to try and prove that that is the brook Kidron. But this is the first moment in the Old Testament upon which the Old Testament is going to build repeatedly with Kidrons. But this is the first moment in which what goes into the river is representative of the past being crushed and destroyed, because God is a jealous God. And what I mean by God is a jealous God is that if he's going to commit himself to you, he wants you to commit yourself to him. And so God says, if we're going to enter into a spiritual renewal, I'm going to crush what is in your past. I'm going to throw it in the river. What happens in a river is things flow away. And so there's going to be no reassemblage of whatever goes into that river. This is why the early church believed in baptizing in rivers. You know, there's always been this debate. Can you get baptized with a cup of water poured over your head? Can you get baptized in a baptistry? Can you get sprinkled with garden tools, whatever? In reality, I guess you can get baptized in whatever you want to be baptized in. But I think the early church looked at the river as a means of things that went in, flowed away, and can't be reassembled. It was symbolic. No one is saved by the river. Therefore, the river holds a meaning. So Moses puts the ashes into the water. Boom, there they go. Now, that starts a chain of events in the Old Testament. So you want to go look for narrative clues, okay? You want to go find your Kidron, John 18:1. You want to go find it in the Old Testament. And what you will find is that when you find Kidron, you find it in the same context over and over and over. And that means the Bible's trying to tell you something. And so we want to do a good old-fashioned Bible study. And in a good old-fashioned Bible study, you daisy-chain scriptures along to come back to where you get started. At least that's how I study. So I'm looking at a John 18:1 and I go, I want to see what Kidron can tell me. then I want to go find those. And when you find them, isolate them. Here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one. These are all Kidron. What do these Kidron verses have in common? And what could I learn by reading those Kidron verses? Okay, 1 Kings chapter 15. I want to show you 3 different kings in the Old Testament. We're going to talk about Asa, we're going to talk about Josiah, we're going to talk about Hezekiah, at least in this portion of the lesson. I'm not going to give you their biography, not going to give you their history. Quite frankly, you don't even have to remember their names. What you do want to remember is what the Old Testament tells you about Kidron. Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did his father David. 1 Kings 15. And he banished the perverted persons from the land and removed all the idols that his fathers had made. This phrase, perverted persons, is an interesting phrase in the English, but in the Hebrew even more so. I'm going to give you a little nugget that you can file away, all right, in your little spiritual filing cabinet. And then in our Silencing the Lamb series, we're going to get into some stuff over the next few months, and you're going to want that nugget. And here is that nugget. Idolatry, as defined in the Bible, was almost always connected to sexually perverse sins. It is why the Bible almost always links idolatry and fornication. Because in the foreign gods of the land, be it the Greeks, the Romans, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, religious ritual was almost always accompanied by sexual ecstasy. So if you could be sexually satisfied in the presence of worship, that was the highest form of worship. So worship always degenerated in the terms of secular worship. It always degenerated into the flesh. Okay? And those examples of sexuality were never pure because they were never inside a covenant. And the book of Hebrews makes a distinction for Christians. Remember, the book of Hebrews says the marriage bed is undefiled. It was Hebrews' way of saying, remember, Hebrews is the Jesus is better than book. Jesus is better than Israel. Jesus is better than Moses. Jesus is better than Aaron. Jesus is better than lambs. Jesus is better than Jerusalem. Jesus is better than the law. Worship of Jesus will not include what worship of the stuff of empire or the world will include, because the sexuality that's always associated with secular worship or idolatry vanishes in the Christian worship because God confines sexuality to the marriage bed. That was the whole point in Hebrews for even telling you that, was so that Christians didn't mimic or imitate the idolatrous practices of the world. Now, why I told you you'll need to file that away for later in the Silencing the Lamb series is because we will get into the message that the Lamb speaks, or that Jesus speaks to the 7 churches at Asia. And they almost always deal with idolatry, and closely linked is fornication. And so you go, well, were they all serving gods and sleeping with people they weren't married to? And if you do that, you divorce 2 things that went together, which was secular idolatry and the ecstasy of sexual idolatry and the fleshly abandonment of natural idolatry. And so keeping that in mind, that phrase, perverse persons, that was the reason I brought that up, because to understand what's being crushed in Kidron is the phrase perverse persons literally has to do with those involved in sex practices for worship. If you want a prelude to this, you want to do your own study, go home and read Romans 1. Okay? And then Romans chapter 1 is the most famous New Testament passage on sexuality and a perverse sexuality. And when you get done reading it, ask yourself why Paul bothered to bring this up. Because in the context of the chapter, Paul is talking about the idolatry of the Roman Empire and the infiltration it is having into the Roman Christian church. And so Paul starts to show what Roman idolatry looks like. And he lists off these practices in Romans chapter 1. Which is why I believe Paul's not going after sexual practice in Romans 1. He's going after idolatry. He's going after putting something in front of God, and namely a church in the midst of the Roman Empire being coerced by Rome itself. A message that I hope the American church pays attention to. That we don't fall so in love with being American that we forget our first love, was supposed to be Jesus. And that is a dangerous place. It's easy to get there. It's the modern form of idolatry. Okay? And so it's one of the things to think about when you read these stories. He banished the perverted persons from the land. He removed all the idols that his fathers had made. 13. Also, he removed Makkah, his grandmother, from being queen mother because she made an obscene image of Asherah. Gets rid of his own grandma. It doesn't mean he kills her, but it doesn't mean he didn't, but he takes her out of the queen mother position because she had actually made an obscene idol to Asherah. Obscene is a clean English way of probably saying that it was some sexually explicit idol. But Asherah is an interesting character in the Assyrian assemblage of gods. Asherah is a female deity. This is actually a Canaanitess goddess. And you will find some fairly well-researched Hebrew scholars that say that at this point Israel was worshiping Asherah alongside of Jehovah in the temple of Israel as God's wife. And so the reform that happens among the kings is not just to get rid of some perverted looking idol. It was to put God by himself. Okay, it was to remove peers to God, equals to God. And so it was to place God back at the center of the story. What does he do? He cuts down that obscene image. And where does he burn it? By the brook Kidron. There's your first reference in the Old Testament to Kidron being the depository of the ashes of idolatry. We know Moses threw ashes in a river. We don't know what river it was. I'm going to propose to you that it was Kidron because of where Kidron goes in from these stories. Now watch King Josiah. Some people say King Josiah was the greatest king outside of David in Judah's history. 2 Kings 23 verse 4. The king commanded Hilkiah the high priest of the second order, and the doorkeepers to bring out the temple of the Lord all the articles that were made for Baal, for Asherah. There she is again. Asherah, quote unquote, God's wife. Big quote unquote, by the way. All right. And for all the host of heaven, and he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron and carried their ashes to Bethel. Watch this context. Let's kind of keep rolling. Watch this revival. Next verse. He removed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense on the high places in the cities of Judah, in the places all around Jerusalem. Those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun, to the moon, to the constellations, literally in the Hebrew, to the zodiac, and to all the host of heaven. And he brought out the wooden image from the house of the Lord to the brook Kidron, outside Jerusalem. He burned it at the brook Kidron. He ground it into ashes, and he threw its ashes on the graves of the common people. Verse 7. Then he tore down the ritual booths of the perverted persons. Perverted persons is a clean Old English way of the old Hebrew sexual idolatry. Houses of the perverted persons, by the way, are rooms of prostitution. He tore down the ritual booths of the perverted persons that were in the house of the Lord. Where were they? They were literally in the house of the Lord. By the way, this gets reinserted into Christian practice in the first century in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. When Paul says, such were some of you, but you are washed, but you are sanctified, but you are justified by God. And then he says, why would you fornicate? Because you know that your body becomes one with the object of fornication? Remember that 1 Corinthians 6? This is going on at the temple in Corinth. Corinth is such a Greek-influenced city that Christian practice was starting to bring in the idolatry of the world and the perverseness of the world into their practice. And Paul warns them against it. He goes, this isn't who you are. And it even prompts Paul to say, all things are lawful, but not all things are expedient. In other words, it's lawful for you to go in and do this, but it sure ain't helping you. You want to know why you have the problems you have? Because you're doing this kind of foolishness. And no, it's not against the law, but that doesn't mean you need to do it. And I've been saying this to people now in Grace for a decade. It's not against the law, but it's still going to hurt to do it. You go, well, if God's not mad at me, sure he's not mad at you. But you invite a bunch of chaos into your life that needs removed, and the Holy Spirit's going to keep working on you to remove it because it has no place in your covenant, it has no place in your walk. So that gets reinserted, but he tears down the ritual booths of the perverted persons that are in the house of the Lord, where the women wove hangings for the wooden image. And he brought all the priests from the cities of Judah. He defiled the high places where the priests had burned incense, from Geba to Beersheba. He broke down the high places at the gates, which were at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city, which were to the left of the city gate. Nevertheless, the priests of the high places did not come up to the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem, but they ate unleavened bread among their brethren. And he defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no man might make his son or his daughter pass through the fire to Molech. They were offering their children as human sacrifices. This was a perversion that snuck into Israel worship in 2 Kings 23. I'm going to leave that. Then he removed the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun at the entrance of the house of the Lord by the chamber of Nathan Melech, the officer who was in the court. He burned down the chariots of the sun with fire. And then finally, the altars that were on the roof, the upper chamber of Ahaz, which the kings of Judah had made, the altars which Manasseh had made, in the two courts of the house of the Lord, the king broke them down. He pulverized them there, and he threw their dust into the brook Kidron. So Kidron pops up 3 times in the reforms of Josiah, all within one chapter. And what's he doing? He's just knocking all the old idolatry down. All of the filth of idolatry, all of the stuff that is compromising covenantal relationship with God. He's crushing it to powder and he's throwing it in the brook. Here's another one from Hezekiah. Not quite as many verses this time. 2 Chronicles 29:16, King Hezekiah. The priests went into the inner part of the house of the Lord to cleanse it. They brought out all the debris that they found in the temple of the Lord to the court of the house of the Lord. And the Levites took the debris out and they carried it where? To the brook Kidron. Here's one more. Same guy. Chapter 30. Now many people, a very great assembly, gathered at Jerusalem to keep the feast of unleavened bread in the 2nd month. They rose, took away the altars that were in Jerusalem, took away all the incense altars and cast them into the brook Kidron. Okay, overkill? Yes. Have to do it that way so that maybe we get an idea. Why would John bother? None of the other Gospels say Jesus crosses the brook Kidron to go into Gethsemane, but the moment John writes it down, if you're a student of the Old Testament, you're going to know Kidron's more than a geographic location. You're going to know Kidron means something, because to a Jew, Kidron was the moment when the revival hit its apex. If you were burning stuff at Kidron, if you were going to Kidron, you were only going for one reason, because you were putting something behind you that you were never supposed to be attached to. You were burning up your past. You were divorcing all of your other commitments. You were laying bare a piece of your soul to say, I'm recommitted to who you are. Kidron represents something. It represents this massive moment in the life and the existence. And here's what I think the other Gospels do to try to aid the story of Kidron. Matthew, Mark, Luke, the other Gospel accounts talk about Jesus cleansing the temple when he comes into Jerusalem, right? When he enters Jerusalem for Passion Week, what does he do? He goes to the temple and he clears out the tables of the money changers and he says, you've made my Father's house, which is supposed to be a house of prayer, you've made it into a den of thieves. So he goes in, cleanses the Father's house, and then crosses Kidron. What's that mean? Symbolically, he crushes whatever stands in the way between us and the Father, and he buries the ashes in the river. He goes into the temple and he clears it out and he walks across Kidron, because for every Jew that watches this action, he comes out of the temple. What did Asa do? What did Josiah do? What did Hezekiah do? What did Moses do? They went into the temple of the Lord and they took the junk that was in the way of relationship and they crushed it and they dropped it in Kidron. And Jesus walks into the temple and he knocks everything down and he walks across the brook Kidron, because what he's telling them is nothing is supposed to stand in the way of the relationship you're supposed to have with my Father. Nothing. It's the ultimate. It's the whole reason for our existence, is this unimpeded relationship, this marriage of sorts, in which there is no third party. There is no outside intimacy. We don't share our covenant partner any more than God shares us or his affection for us. The beauty of God's love for us is that God doesn't love me more than God loves you. And God doesn't love you more than God loves me. And this one is hard to swallow. God doesn't love any of us in this room more than he loves people out there who would never come into this room. He doesn't love us more because we love him. We love because he first loved us. And because we know we are loved, we then send that love out. But God doesn't cheat in that he parcels love out to certain degrees for some people, but lesser degrees for other people. Because that would be a form of spiritual idolatry, idolatry and adultery. It would be God cheating on our covenant, in which He's supposed to pour His love out without respect of persons. And for God to do it any other way would be God committing adultery on His church. How do we do that in reverse? Well, it's not just that we love other things. We certainly love our family, we love our lives, we love the things God has committed to us. But by putting anything else on par with Him, as if anything else is our deliverer, as if anything else is our redeemer, when our confidence gets placed in any other place, it's a form of that, adultery. And all things are lawful, but they're certainly not expedient. And in that form, we need to keep seeing Jesus cross Kidron on our behalf. We need to keep watching Jesus tear the junk out of the temple so that there's nothing left for us to run back to. Or think of it this way. I wanted to put a couple verses from deep in the canon together. This is the end of the New Testament, and probably near the end of the canon itself. Jude 1:21. I want to show you two keep yourselves, because I think this is the message of the first century church. Jude 1:21. Keep yourselves in the love of God, looking for the mercy of our Lord Jesus Christ unto eternal life. 1 John 5:21. Little children, keep yourselves from idols. Now, let me just say this, because I definitely do the comparison because in the English they're so similar. Keep yourselves in love, keep yourselves from idols. But I also want to point out that 1 John 5:21, John's whole letter is not even about idolatry. It's a pretty fascinating thing if you ever go read 1 John. What's 1 John basically about? I mean, that's the book where you really discover the new covenant theology of love. God is love. What we're not to love, what we are to love, who loves us. That's we love because He first loved us. That's 1 John. It's chock full of love. And then all of a sudden, literally in the last sentence, little children, keep yourself from idols. It's almost as if John gets to the end of his paper, like he doesn't have any more room to write, and he goes, I was going to write about idolatry. And he goes, okay, well, little kids, keep yourself from idolatry. But that's not it at all. I think what is happening is that if you couple the message, say, that Jude has, which is just a smattering of John's message, or it's a condensing, rather, of John's big message, which is God is love and keep yourself in that love. Think about this. Message of the early church is that you are loved. Message of the church today should be you are loved. Keep yourself in that. How? Remind yourself of what He has done on your behalf. Remind yourself of the love that God has for you. You're going to have to remind yourself because the world's not going to remind you, and your guilt's not going to remind you, and your past is not going to remind you. So you're going to have to do it. You're going to have to keep yourself in the love. It doesn't mean you got to live right so God will keep loving you. It means you're going to have to consciously keep yourself in His love. When you do that, that's the equipment to keep yourself from idolatry, which was the great fear of the early church, is that we would drift. Now, we don't think in terms, when we think idolatry, we think of little golden calves, and we go, idolatry is not a problem, Pastor. We don't have an idolatry problem in the church because we don't build little statues and bow down to them. But that's sort of the elementary version of understanding idolatry. The reason why the New Testament warns us to keep ourselves from idolatry, I think, is because it's so easy to become infatuated with the ease of life. It's so easy to become infatuated with the security of life, with stability, that we start to seek those things rather than the way Jesus said, seek first the kingdom, and all that stuff gets added to you. The toughest part about being a Christian in America, what's the toughest part about being a Christian in the wealthiest, most comfortable country that's ever been on the face of the earth? What's the toughest part about being a Christian in that? Not falling in love. Not falling in love with it and its security, and feeling as if you could just improve that system, you might be able to usher in some sort of heaven on earth. And here is the early church in the seat of what to that day was bragging about being the most peaceful empire in the history of the world, the wealthiest empire in the history of the world, the most influential empire in the history of the world, the Roman Empire. And so the early church fathers are going, careful, 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 watch out. Don't get idolatrous. Don't fall in love with this thing. Don't fall into the comfort of ease. And that, to me, is why you see that first generation of Christians embracing persecution, going, being persecuted, we're struggling in the system. It's evidence that we haven't laid ourselves down at the altar of this world, and we haven't sort of acquiesced over to the comforts of this world, but instead we're still putting up a resistance against it. We talked about the resistance a few weeks ago and what that looks like. And so I think when Jesus is crossing that Kidron, he's still crossing that for us all of the time as we get an idea of what he's doing to put into the past and to crush all of those other things that try to stand in the way of who he is. Look at those first two verses again from John 18. When Jesus had spoke these words, I want you to see this because I want you to make a connection here we're going to make from the Old Testament as well. Jesus spoke these words. He went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron where there was a garden, and when he and his disciples entered, Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. John doesn't break these into verses. Remember, John's just telling a story. John very quickly introduces another person onto the stage. Jesus crosses into Kidron with his disciples. Boom, here comes Judas Iscariot. And everyone knows Judas Iscariot as the betrayer. We've done whole lessons on him here. I don't want to get too deep into the character, the reason, and all this stuff behind Judas. What you need to know is that Jesus knows what's about to descend upon him. He intentionally walks across Kidron, knowing the Old Testament, knowing what Kidron represents, knowing that what he's doing represents the putting away of the idols, it puts away of the past, but knowing that on the other side of Kidron is a man who's there to betray him and a man who's there to kill him, and yet Jesus walks straight into the challenge of his betrayer. And one of the things that I think this would have said, definitely to the disciples who were there, and certainly to the Bible student, is that Jesus is fixing an Old Testament chaotic story. He's making it right. Let me explain. Sometimes in the Old Testament, you're reading along, and you're going to be disappointed with the characters. How can you not be? Have you ever read David and Bathsheba and not been a little disappointed in David? Have you ever read David and Bathsheba and not been infuriated with David? Is more like it. Not just disappointed, but what are you doing with yourself? So that's one example. It's probably the one that hits everyone's mind first. Certainly the most extreme example. But we'll read those Old Testament stories and we'll think, man, I wish this would have went differently. Or you'll see characters who are archetypes of things, and you'll wish they had been different. Let's go take David. David is, by all accounts, Israel's greatest example of a king, in that he is the warrior with a heart of gold. He defeats Goliath. And yet he opens the flap on David's tabernacle and lets all of Israel go walk right up to the Ark of the Covenant and experience the presence of the Lord. He's a man called the apple of God's eye. He's called a man after God's own heart. When Jesus comes, they never call him the son of Elijah, but they call him the son of David. The archetypes aren't always perfect, because you want Jesus to be son of David when he faces the devil, but you don't want Jesus to be son of David when he's hanging out with Mary Magdalene. Right? You get my point. And you'd never assume that he carries the qualities over one for one, two for two. Whatever David had, Jesus had exactly. Same way as I call Jesus the Elisha of the New Testament, because John the Baptist was obviously the Elijah of the New Testament. Jesus said that. Who was after Elijah? Who had a double portion of Elijah's spirit? Elisha. Jesus mimics some Elisha miracles. But you don't want Jesus to mimic Elisha perfectly, because the first kids that come along and make fun of him, he calls 2 she-bears out of the woods and mauls 40-something kids. And you go, well, okay, I don't want him to be the perfect representation of Elisha, but I actually do want him to be Elisha as if Elisha were perfect. And that's the beauty of watching the Jesus stories. You get to take the place in the Old Testament where you go, I'm a little disappointed, I wish it had went different. And then you get to watch Jesus fix it. He gets to do it better. He gets to do the exact same thing and make a better move. And I don't think there's a better example in the entire Bible than Kidron. Here's a story that you might have forgot about. There's a character in the Old Testament by the name of Absalom, who is one of the most important figures in the story of Israel. for a number of reasons. Remember when I told you earlier that there is an offshoot of problems that begin when polygamy enters into man's mind early in the process in Israel? The problems produce a Hagar and an Ishmael. The problems produce, well, you can go down the list in the book of Genesis. David's one of the issue. He's one who has this issue in spades, so to speak. He has no problem creating chaos in his own marriage and in his own life, basically by having multiple wives. His son will take it to the nth degree. Solomon has 300 wives and 700 concubines. I'm not sure how anybody keeps up with 1,000 of anything in life, much less relationships, if you would call them that. But the Bible starts to list off David's kids, and it's actually kind of an embarrassing list because it goes, he had this kid with this woman, and then he had this kid with this woman, and then he had this kid. It literally does this. It lists 3 or 4 kids. And at one point in the story, it lists that David had a boy with one woman, a girl with another woman, and a boy with another woman. And then it starts to tell the story of those 3 kids. Now, they all have the same dad, but 3 different moms. One of them's name is Amnon, one of them's name is Tamar, and one of them's name is Absalom. And the Bible describes Absalom as the most handsome man in all of Israel. He has long, flowing locks of hair that every year he makes a big public spectacle of cutting them off, probably to the chagrin of all the ladies, and he sells it in the marketplace, and it's this massive deal. He's sort of the cover boy of Israel. He's the new David, and he's super protective of his half-sister Tamar. But his half-brother Amnon is a bit of a pervert, and Amnon really wants to get with his half-sister Tamar. This is not a clean Sunday school story. It's the kind that you probably had skipped, in fact, when you were a kid in Sunday school. No one brings a group of 6-year-olds in and goes, hey, let me tell you about the time that one of David's kids raped his sister. Because that's what happens. And the moment he rapes his sister, he hates her, which is a really deep psychological fact about getting something you've wanted, but getting it the wrong way. And so he hates Tamar, and he doesn't want anything to do with her, and so he kicks her out, bringing public shame to her. And Absalom is infuriated. And Absalom sends word to his dad, do you know what your son did? And David, in one of the weakest moments in a king's life, does nothing. And Absalom spends the next 2 years plotting revenge against his stepbrother. And one day, he murders Amnon. And word comes back to David that Absalom has killed his half-brother Amnon. And David banishes Absalom, who hasn't been able to talk to his dad in a few years anyhow. And Absalom, who is young and ambitious and handsome and personable, congregates an army around him to go overthrow his dad. And Absalom storms Jerusalem and comes against his father with a troop full of soldiers. And in a moment that starts to look a whole lot like Judas Iscariot walking in with a troop full of soldiers, Absalom comes and attacks Jerusalem. And before David allows himself to fall at the hands of his son, the Bible tells us that David goes on the run. 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 23. And all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people crossed over. King David himself crossed over the brook Kidron, and all the people crossed over towards the way of the wilderness. And so David, his betrayer on his tail, takes to Kidron and crosses and runs away from the issue. And this is the scene of great chaos in the book of 2 Samuel. And Jesus, faced with the exact, they're never 1 for 1, 2 for 2. The stories are not exactly the same. But Jesus is faced with a man who's out to betray him. And Jesus doesn't rush across Kidron away from his betrayer. He rushes across Kidron towards his betrayer. It's the great moment of scriptural redemption. It's the great moment of defense that Jesus does go defend the Tamars of the world. He does go put the idolatry of adultery and rape and murder and perversion, and he crushes it and lays it in the brook. And he doesn't run from those who hate him. He doesn't run from his betrayer. He runs to him, knowing all things that were about to descend upon him. Jesus crosses Kidron to face Judas Iscariot because he wants to leave you with a message. Don't run away. Go straight in to wherever it is you're supposed to go. Trust that your Jesus has given you the template, that he has showed you the way to do this. Here's what it looks like when he gets there. David crossed Kidron to avoid his betrayer. Jesus crosses Kidron to confront his. Remember, Kidron is darkness. The darkness and all it holds must be faced. Jesus will show you how. Watch how he does it. John chapter 18, verse number 6. When he said to them, I'm he, they drew back and fell to the ground. And he asked them again, whom are you seeking? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Verse 8. Jesus answered, I told you I'm he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke. Of those whom you gave me, I have lost none. Verse 10. Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. A lot of good stuff there. We're going to get into it next week. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword in its sheath. Look at this question. Shall I not drink the cup my Father's given me? Look at this. I have to drink the cup my dad's given me. This is my destiny. This is what I'm here to do. I'm to cross over to drink this cup. What's that cup look like? The cup of Christ contained this confrontation, and it contained Jesus' response. When we drink his cup, and remember, Jesus told James and John, you indeed can drink the cup that I'm going to drink. When we drink it, what's in it? When we drink that cup, we're agreeing to his response. We are agreeing to cross over into the darkness and sometimes lose in order to win, because that's the cup we drank when we signed up with Jesus. We walk into his death so we can walk into his life. We don't get to pull the sword. We don't get to kill Judas. We don't get to fight against him, but we don't run from him. We face him. We drink the cup Jesus drank, because there's a victory by walking into that you'll never know if you don't walk in. What I'm doing is I'm trying to encourage the child of God. Watch how Jesus does it. Accept his victory. Jesus has crushed all the rivals and dropped them into the river Kidron. But he's crossed over to walk into the darkness, because sometimes you're going to have to walk into the darkness. Sometimes you're going to have to face the biggest of situations. And when you get in there, don't worry. You can drink the cup Jesus drank. You can have the response Jesus had. You don't have to have the natural reaction of the world. You have the response that comes only from Jesus and who he is. That last phrase, we are agreeing to lose in order to win, goes down sideways. It's not an easy one to swallow, but it's what Jesus asks of us. It's kind of what Paul meant, I think, in 1 Corinthians 6, when he says to the Corinthian church, that same church that was committing fornication in the temple, and he goes, why are you suing one another? Christians suing Christians in secular court. He said, could you not allow yourselves to be wronged? The great question of the faith is, could you not allow yourself to be wronged? You can't allow yourself to be wronged if you don't follow Jesus across Kidron. Because you got to win every battle. You got to win every argument. You got to win every fight. You got to overcome every Judas. But if you allow yourselves to hold hand with Jesus and walk across Kidron, you're putting the cup to your lips that says, I don't have to win in the natural to follow my Jesus. Because there's a battle coming up at Calvary that Jesus is going to win and give me a resurrection reality that's way better than anything I can walk into in this world. So don't run from it. There's chaos going on in the world. Don't worry about it. Cross the Kidron and walk right into it. You walk in with your Jesus. You don't have to win the argument. You don't have to win the confrontation. But you know how this thing ends. And you know there's a resurrection coming. When Jesus knew all that was going to descend upon him and he could still go forward, it sends the great message to us. You don't have to have everything rosy in your future. Whatever it is going to descend upon you, walk forward with Jesus. Cross Kidron. Take two things away tonight. Take this. Whatever else is on the playing field, Jesus has conquered it and overcome it. He's put it in the sea of his forgetfulness, characterized by the flowing brook of Kidron. He's taken every idol, he's taken every master, he's taken every overlord, and he's dropped it into that river. Receive that in your own walk in Jesus' name. And don't resuscitate any of the things he's knocked down. And the other thing you take is that Jesus walks forward even when he knows it's going to be rough, because that's what the true victor does. The victim knows it's going to be rough and runs scared and hides. The victor, even though he knows he'll have to lose in order to win, crosses Kidron and says, I'm not running from Absalom. I'm running to Absalom. I'm not running from Judas. I'm running to Judas because I'm going to fix where David messed up. And I didn't even see this till we were reading the text. Jesus turns to the soldiers and says, can you let these guys go? Because he's so concerned with the people he's bringing with him. That's him defending the Tamar. That's him defending the outcast and the abused and the cut down. Where David fails, Jesus succeeds. Jesus faces those adversities and overcomes them. If he does it, greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. Father, thank you for our Kidron. Thank you for it. It represents something. It represents that you have no rival on the field of my heart. That if I trust in you, there is nothing that can rival your victory, your wisdom, your success. Father, give me a revival in my spirit that knocks down anything that I have elevated to the level that belongs only to you. Put it in the waters of your Kidron. And Father, teach me to walk across Kidron and face my Judas. Judas isn't always just a person. He's an encounter. And let me walk into that encounter knowing that you never run when things descend upon you. That's courage. Teach me not to run when things descend upon me, for I have a template who teaches me to cross my own Kidron. And when I get there, I face my Gethsemane, the place where you press, where I sweat great drops of blood. But I'm not redeemed by sweating great drops of blood. I'm redeemed because you sweat great drops of blood. I don't become your righteousness because I survive my Gethsemane. I survive my Gethsemane because I'm your righteousness. And I thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen.